Dad called me a stupid at my mom's birthday party and said, "You've always been a selfish, your sister better than you." Everyone was silent, and then I said, "You will not receive money from me." My mother's birthday party was supposed to be a simple family reunion. I'd been avoiding them for months, ever since I finally put my foot down and told them I was no longer their personal ATM. But no matter how much distance I put between us, there was always an excuse to drag me back in. This time it was my mom's birthday. I knew that skipping it would only add to the never-ending list of things they could use to paint me as the bad son. So I went. I even paid for the restaurant, as I always did. It was a nice place, too nice for them, really. Not that they couldn't appreciate a good meal, but because they never paid for anything themselves. My parents had mastered the art of living off others while pretending they were doing you a favor by letting you help them. The moment I walked in, I could feel the tension. My sister gave me a little nod, my aunts and uncles acknowledged me, but my parents? My father barely looked up from his drink. My mom just acted like I should be grateful she even invited me. Classic. Dinner started, and for a while it was bearable. I sat through the fake conversations, the forced laughter, the small talk that meant nothing. I could tell my dad had been drinking, which was never a good sign. The more he drank, the more honest he became, and his honesty was always ugly. Then, out of nowhere, he turned to me in front of everyone and said it. "You have always been selfish. Your sister is better than you." It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a casual remark. He said it like it was a fact, like it was something everyone in the room already knew and agreed with. The table fell silent. My sister looked uncomfortable, my mother just kept eating like nothing had happened, and the rest of the family either looked away or pretended they had suddenly forgotten how to listen. No one ever challenged him. No one ever called him out. They just let him be the loudest voice in the room. But not me. Not anymore. I put down my fork, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and looked him dead in the eye. "You're not getting any money from me." That got a reaction. His face tightened, his jaw clenched, and for the first time that night, he really looked at me. My mother finally put down her fork, my aunts exchanged glances, and I could feel the change in the air. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth: my parents never cared about me. They cared about what I could give them. I had spent years handing them money every time they called with some dramatic story about how they were struggling. But they weren't struggling. They were wasting it. On gambling. On things I won't even mention here. I was in real estate, making good money, selling mansions in Los Angeles, spending my days negotiating with high-profile clients. Then I turned around and gave thousands of dollars to my parents, who spent it like monopoly money. And I was done. My dad's expression turned ugly. My mom, realizing that ignoring it wasn't working, decided to escalate. She grabbed a bowl of soup, ready to throw it at me like a scene from a bad reality show. My aunt barely stopped her in time, pulling her hand back before she could. But that didn't mean I was safe. The next thing I knew, my mom was standing up and screaming at me in front of the entire restaurant, calling me ungrateful, saying that after all they had done for me, this was how I was repaying them. That I had no right to come here and eat their food and disrespect them. Their food. That I had paid for. And then she did it anyway. She grabbed the bowl from my aunt's hand and threw it at me. The soup, hot, sticky, and probably expensive, splattered all over my brand new suit. The one I had bought for a meeting the next day. I stood up so quickly that I almost knocked over my chair. My father was still seething, my mother was still screaming, and the rest of the family was in shock. But no one said a word to defend me. Not one person. That was it. I had taken their insults, their manipulation, their endless demands, but this? This was different. This was public. This was intentional. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just grabbed my keys, turned around, and walked out. And as I walked out, I made a decision. They had treated me like a walking wallet for years, but they had forgotten one thing. The house they lived in? The one they bragged about? I bought it. That car they drove? Mine. And if they wanted to pretend I was nothing, I was going to show them exactly what nothing felt like. Tomorrow I was going to take it all back. I barely slept that night. My suit was ruined, my phone exploded with messages from relatives telling me to be the bigger person, and I kept replaying the scene in my head. My father's smug face, my mother's indignation, the way no one except my grandfather had looked at me with anything close to compassion. That's when I knew. They weren't going to change. They didn't even feel bad. In their eyes, I was still the selfish one who had cut off their free ride. By morning, I was done thinking about it. I got up, made some coffee, and started making phone calls. First, my real estate attorney. The house was in my name. My parents had never bothered to check the paperwork, too busy bragging to their friends about their beautiful home. I told my attorney to prepare the listing. The house went on the market immediately. Next, their car. Also mine. I called the dealership to arrange for repossession. Then, just for fun, I checked their credit card statements. I had co-signed 1 year ago when they begged me to help build their credit, and I never got around to removing myself from the account. Big mistake. Thousands of dollars in charges. Casinos, 5-star hotels, luxury shopping, and things I couldn't even begin to justify. I called the bank. Reported my card stolen. Cancelled everything. By noon, I was on a plane to Los Angeles for a meeting. I had more important things to do than sit around and wait for their response. But I didn't have to wait long. The first call was from my mother. Screaming. Asking why the car was gone. I let it go to voicemail. The second was from my father. More screaming. Something about me ruining their lives. Deleted. Then my sister. She didn't scream, but she asked me to reconsider. Said they were freaking out, that they didn't know what to do, that they had nowhere to go. I texted her a sentence back. Not my problem. By the time I landed in LA, my lawyer had already lined up potential buyers for the house. Real estate moves fast in this market, and with the location, I knew it would sell in no time. Then the real surprise. My grandfather called. Now, Grandpa never got involved in family drama. He was old school, quiet, the kind of guy who only spoke when necessary. But this time he had something to say. Good job, kid. I was so stunned I almost dropped my phone. Grandpa told me he had been warning my parents for years. Told them to stop using me. Told them to respect me. They never listened. He said they deserved what happened to them. That maybe sleeping on the street would teach them a lesson. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. Don't sell the house yet. I have an idea. I had no idea what he was planning, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had someone on my side. And whatever his plan was, I was all for it. I wasn't sure what Grandpa had in mind, but I trusted him more than anyone else in the family. If he had an idea, I was ready to hear it. We met at a little diner outside of town. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where people went about their business. Grandpa ordered black coffee, stared at me for a long moment, then finally spoke. Your father thinks he's untouchable. Thinks he can do whatever he wants and still come out on top. It's time he learned what it feels like to lose. I already liked where this was going. Grandpa had a plan. Instead of selling the house right away, I'd let my parents panic a little. Let them realize the car wasn't coming back, their credit was shot, and their bank account was frozen. No safety net, no easy way out. They had spent years living like kings on my money. Now they'd find out what it was like to have nothing. Then, when reality hit them, I wouldn't sell the house to just anybody I'd rent it out. Not to them, of course. I'd make it a rental and make sure they had to watch someone else live in their house while they had to figure out where to go. But what if they beg? I asked. Grandpa grinned. Then we make them work for it. This part confused me. Work for it? My parents had never worked for anything in their lives. They expected handouts. They expected me to fix everything. But if Grandpa had a way to make them feel real consequences, I was interested. By the time I left the diner, I was on board with the plan. I gave my lawyer new instructions: hold off on selling the house. Instead, list it as a rental. No discounts, no favors. If my parents wanted to stay, they'd have to apply like everyone else and prove they could pay. Of course, they had no income. No savings. Nothing but entitlement. 2 days later, the meltdown began. My father called first, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. He demanded to know what was happening, why their house was listed as a rental. My mom followed with a voicemail full of dramatic sobs. My sister texted me nonstop, saying they were desperate and had nowhere to go. Then, the best part, my dad asked if they could borrow money to cover the rent deposit. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my phone. I texted back, "You said I was being selfish, remember? Figure it out." But they didn't figure anything out. Instead, they showed up at my office. And that's when things got really interesting. I was in the middle of a meeting when my assistant knocked on my office door, looking nervous. She hesitated before speaking, as if she wasn't sure if she should even say it out loud. "Your parents are here. They won't leave." I closed my eyes for a second, exhaled, then pushed my chair back. I had expected this. Ever since I cut them off and put the house up for rent, the calls and texts had been nonstop. But I ignored every one of them. They must have realized that begging wasn't working, so now they had come straight to my office, thinking they could embarrass me into submission. I walked out into the lobby, and there they were, my dad pacing like he was preparing for a fight, my mom sitting with her arms crossed, her expression already in full victim mode. My sister stood a few feet away, shifting uncomfortably, as if she had been dragged into this against her will. As soon as my dad saw me, he stomped over and jabbed a finger in my direction. "You think you can just kick us out like some strangers? After all we've done for you?" I almost laughed. Done for me? That was rich. What exactly had they done? Raised me? Fed me? Put a roof over my head? That was the bare minimum of parenting, and they had barely done that. Meanwhile, I bought them a house, a car, covered their expenses for years until I finally woke up and realized that to them, I wasn't their son. I was their walking paycheck. I kept my voice calm. "If you want to live in the house, you can apply like everyone else. But you'll have to prove you can pay the rent." My mother shot up from her seat. "We are your parents. You should be helping us, not humiliating us." I looked at my sister. She looked exhausted. She wasn't on their side, not really, but she wasn't about to speak up either. She never did. She was the good child because she never fought back. My father let out a harsh laugh. "You're nothing without us. We made you. You owe us." Something inside me snapped. I stepped closer, making sure he could hear me loud and clear. "I owe you? I built my career. I worked my ass off while you wasted every dollar I gave you. And now you're broke because you never thought this day would come. Well, guess what? It's here." His face turned red. My mother's mouth fell open as if she had just been slapped. My sister stepped back. I turned to my assistant. "Call security." My father's voice rose in pure anger. "You ungrateful little dash." Security arrived almost immediately. They didn't mess around either. Within minutes, my parents were being escorted out, my dad still spewing insults, my mom screaming about how I was a terrible son. My sister hesitated, like she wanted to say something, but in the end she just walked out with them. I stood there and watched them walk out the front door and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. No guilt. No second guessing. Just relief. I turned and walked back to my office, closing the door behind me. My hand shook, but not with anger. With freedom. They no longer had power over me. Then my phone buzzed. It was Grandpa. "Good," he said, his voice calm. "Now let's make it worse for them." I sat up. "What do you mean?" There was a pause, then he chuckled. "You'll see." The next morning I awoke to chaos. My phone was vibrating non-stop calls, texts, voicemails. My mom, my dad, even distant relatives who usually pretended I didn't exist. I didn't even bother to check the messages. I already knew what they were about. Then, just as I was making my coffee, Grandpa called. "Turn on the news," he said. His voice was calm, almost amused. I grabbed the remote and flipped to the local station. The second the screen lit up, I almost dropped my cup. My father had been arrested. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Local man arrested after luxury hotel incident." I turned up the volume. The reporter explained how my parents had been staying at a luxury hotel for the past few days and had racked up a huge bill. They had no intention of paying. When the hotel staff confronted them, my father lost it. He yelled at the manager, shoved a security guard, and tried to storm out as if he were above the law. The police were called, and my dad, being the genius that he is, tried to fight them. The result? He was tackled, handcuffed, and dragged straight to a holding cell. My mom wasn't arrested, but she was permanently banned from the hotel. And the best part? Grandpa was the one who tipped them off. I called him right away. "They did this? They thought they were untouchable," he said. "I thought it was time someone reminded them that actions have consequences." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. My father, the man who spent his life thinking he was smarter than everyone else, had just been caught cheating a hotel like a common crook. My mother, the queen of manipulation, had officially run out of places to hide. But that wasn't the worst of it. While my father was in jail, the house officially went under contract. I had found a buyer, a developer who planned to tear it down. Not rent it. Not remodel it. Tear it down. I stared at the paperwork and felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This house, the one they had flaunted for years, the one they had used to make themselves feel important, was about to be nothing but rubble. Then the texts from my sister began. "You can't do this. You have nowhere to go. They're freaking out. Mom's crying all the time. Just talk to them, please." I ignored her. But she was right about one thing. They had nowhere to go. The car was gone. Their bank accounts were empty. Their credit was destroyed. The house would be gone in less than a month. And now my father had a criminal record. I finally checked my voicemail. My mom's voice came through first, shaky and pathetic. "Ethan, please, we're sorry. We just need help to get back on our feet." Then my dad's. "You ungrateful piece of dash." Deleted. They weren't sorry. They were desperate. For years they had treated me like a wallet, something to be used and discarded. Now they had nothing. And I had never felt better. 2 weeks went by and I heard nothing from my parents. No phone calls, no texts, nothing. The silence was almost peaceful. I figured they had finally accepted reality. Maybe they found another person to suck the life out of. Maybe they were still sitting in their car, waiting for a miracle that would never come. Either way, I didn't care. Then my sister showed up at the office. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept. She sat down across from me, rubbing her hands together as if trying to figure out how to say what she came here for. Finally she sighed. "They live in their car." I leaned back in my chair. "Not my problem." She looked at me with that mixture of frustration and sadness. "Ethan, they have nowhere to go. Dad's too proud to ask for help, but Mom, she's a mess. She cries all the time. They don't even have enough money for gas." I didn't say anything. She continued. "I'm not saying you should give them money, but they're our parents." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Oh, now they're our parents?" "Because last time I checked, I was the only one paying for everything, while you got to sit back and pretend you didn't see what was going on." She winced. "That's not fair, Dash." I cut her off. "No, what's not fair is you treating me like a walking ATM for years. What's not fair is me working my ass off while they sat around and blew through everything I gave them. And now that they've finally hit rock bottom, I'm supposed to feel bad." She was silent. I leaned forward. "Let me ask you something. If I lost everything tomorrow, do you really think they'd be here begging someone to help me?" Or would they just move on and find someone else to take care of them? She looked down. She had no answer. After a long silence, she got up. Before she left, she looked back at me and said, "Grandpa was right about her." I nodded. Yes. He was. A few days later, the house was officially gone. Demolished. I didn't bother telling my parents. Let them find out on their own. I thought that was the end of it. But then Grandpa called me one last time. "Come by the diner," he said. "There's something you need to see." I had no idea what he meant, but I trusted Grandpa, so I went. When I walked in, I saw him sitting in his usual booth, sipping his black coffee. And across from him, looking completely defeated, was my father. I almost turned around and left. But Grandpa waved me over. I sat down, crossed my arms, and waited. My father didn't speak at first. He just stared at the table, as if he couldn't even look at me. Finally he murmured, "I lost everything." I remained silent. Grandpa cleared his throat. "He wants to ask you something." I knew what was coming. "Money?" Grandpa shook his head. "A job." I had not expected this. I turned to my father, barely hiding my amusement. "You want me to hire you?" He nodded slowly. "I have nowhere else to go." I just stared at him for a moment. This was the same man who told me I was nothing without him. Who humiliated me in front of our family. Who let Mom throw soup on me in a restaurant, laughed when I was covered in it, and then tried to act like it was my fault. Now here he was, looking at me like I was his last hope. For the first time in my life, I saw him for who he really was. A weak, broken man who had spent his whole life pretending to be stronger than everyone else. And suddenly I felt nothing for him. No anger. No guilt. No satisfaction. Just nothing. I stood up, grabbed some bills from my pocket, and tossed them on the table for Grandpa's coffee. "Actions have consequences," I said. "You taught me that." Then I walked out. For years I let myself be taken advantage of. I gave and gave, thinking that maybe someday they'd appreciate me. That maybe, deep down, they actually cared. They didn't. They cared about what I could do for them. So when I stopped giving, they stopped pretending. And in the end, they destroyed themselves. My father thought he was untouchable. My mother thought she could guilt her way out of anything. Now they had nothing. And me? I finally had everything. Freedom. Peace. A life without them dragging me down. And I slept better at night knowing that for once, the only person I had to worry about was me.